welcome to Focus 54, your guide to African issues. Your host, my name is Monica Chanda, and we take a look at those very critical issues in Africa, the continent, which hosts 55 countries. But what do we have this week? We will be focusing on that Italy-Africa Summit, and I will be joined by two guests in the second segment, an economist, Tino Kambasha, as well as an international relations expert, Clive Chiridza. But first and foremost, let's get into some of those stories making the headlines. We kickstart with the Sahel region and Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger withdrawing from ECOWAS, accusing a bloc of inhuman sanctions and the military junta in West African nations. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger jointly announcing their immediate withdrawal from the Economic Community of West African States on Sunday. Now, the juntas accusing the regional economic bloc of imposing some of those inhumane sanctions aimed at reversing recent coups in their respective countries. So much for an interesting focus on that particular issue. But now let's move on to South Africa, as ruling party ANC suspending Jacob Zuma, former South African president Jacob Zuma, the membership to the ANC, the Revolutionary Party. So the National Executive Committee of the ruling ANC announcing on Monday, January 29, it had decided to summarily suspend Jacob Zuma as a member, citing committee sources, local media report, and the former president will be held before the party's discipline committee. So the ANC constitution states that proceedings may be invoked and instituted against any member or public representative who joins or supports any organizations or party other than the ANC. Let's see how that unfolds. And in SADC, as we also look at the regional bloc, member states have been implored to reinforce cholera response mechanisms as the region battles an outbreak of the epidemic, and SADC health ministers meeting to assess the cholera situation in the region and also identifying possible measures to comprehensively prevent and control the disease. And Zimbabwe also having put in place that response mechanism. They have those response programs. I'm sure many of you have been kept abreast of that. We've also been flighting that on our ZBC TV and even across our national radio stations. So this is also to reduce the aiming to reduce the number of cholera cases in the country. And that's what we had for you in this first segment. And join us in the second segment as we actually get to look at that Italy-Africa Summit, or should we say, summit diplomacy at play. Who gets to benefit? Is it Africa or the rest of the world? Or Africa should take advantage of that platform? Let's do this on Focus 54. Join us in the second segment. Welcome back to the program, Focus 54. This is the second segment where we delve into African issues. And I have two experts, one in international relations and the other an economist, as we continue to look at a summit, or should we say summit diplomacy. Help me welcome my first guest. He is, of course, an economist, and he is Mr. Clive Chiridza. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
We also have another guest. He works for Italian Trade Agency. Is that correct?
Yes,
Correct
ma'am.
me? And he is Tino Kambasha. Welcome to Focus 54.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for having me.
So we are looking at the Italy-Africa Summit and African leaders. We did have our leaders congregate and looking at some of the issues to do with trade among many of those bilateral relations. Zimbabwe, much like the African nations, does have those engagements with Italy. So let's start first and foremost, if we ought to look in relation to Italy, the Italy-Africa Summit. Why is it that when African leaders or African countries attend these summits, it's often described as some sort of development because after all, Africa has a 1.39 billion population. And if we are to look, as of 2023, it was reported the GDP was about 3.1 trillion United States dollars. Let's start with you, Tino.
Well, in terms of when African leaders attend summits, it's seen as if, well, it's put in a negative context through media. I mean, we have Davos, nobody complains about that, but because maybe it's African leaders going to one country, I don't necessarily see a problem with that. And I think, yes, you are right, in terms of GDP as an African continent, it is pretty low compared to the number of people, the resources we have, and just the ability to trade amongst ourselves. And I think that's the first thing, is that we're not united as a continent. And I think summits like these actually give us a chance to actually sit down and say, how can we work together as Africans, and what can we give the European markets as well? So I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. I actually think it's a very good thing. And also, I look forward to seeing Zimbabwe hosting the European countries.
Would love to see that. But from an international relations expert, some may call these summits some sort of summit diplomacy. What do you make of it? Is it development at the same time?
Okay. In part of your question, there is a very important phrase that captured my attention as an international relations expert. You mentioned a term that goes often sees as development, which means this is an observation, long-term, long-time observation, a perception that has been brewed over time. And the question is, development in whose eyes, in whose perspective? Because remember, in these engagements, we are having diverse actors. So it's development according to who? So before I answer your question directly, let me take you through what a human being is, simply because this is a foreign policy issue. And issues as these are quite complex in their nature. Not only are you supposed to give judgments based on assertions given at face value, no. You will be prone to risk of fundamental attribution error, where overemphasis of personal, subjective, even dispositional factors overthrows situational, environmental, political, as well as historical factors. So according to Hans Morgenthau, he says a human being is naturally aggressive, always in pursuit of power, selfish, not even driven by morality. And the human beings are the sole functionaries of states. So in a way, we can conclude that character of states is assumed from character of human beings. Now, when it comes to Italy in this context, the Prime Minister Meloni made it very clear that this summit aims at three major objectives. Number one, rebuilding of concrete partnerships with Africa, obviously for the benefit of Italy. Secondly, a deliberation on how they can ameliorate illegal migration of migrants from Africa to Europe. Thirdly, Italy wants to position itself as an energy hub which connects the whole of Europe and Africa. So it can be development in the perspective of the Italian. But what of, from an Afrocentric point of view, is this development, is this a neo-colonial tool?
Well, that question could be posed to many others. Let's talk about whether, from what you have raised, whether there is a fair deal at play. Because let's talk about October 2023. Italy actually revealed a $633 million budget that was towards the Italian Fund for Horizontal Cooperation for Africa from 2024 to 2025. And this is a period of 3 years. So areas like energy, like you mentioned, health, education, are the keys, and each country receiving $11 million yearly and to around 34 million in 3 years' time. So in comparison to the resources that Italy's anticipated to benefit from Africa, can this be regarded as a fair deal? Because energy already, we're looking at African countries. There have been a lot of discoveries and potential for oil reserves, and energy is big on the agenda. So the question lies, is this a fair deal? I'll still come back to you, Clive.
Okay. In fact, I really need to mention something very important, taking it from the last question you asked, getting into this current question. As Prime Minister Meloni was explaining, she put forth a plan termed the Mattei plan, and this originates from a rich and gigantic oil and gas company in Italy called Eni. So in as much as this can be perceived as a diplomatic setting where there is equal footing and fairness, but we need to understand that Italy is after their own interests, and in this case they need natural resources from Africa. Coming on to the issue of fairness, you are making mention of 633 million in a period of 3 years, right? And if we do some mathematics here, it means that is 211 million per year. And we are having 211 million United States dollars being invested in a $3.1 trillion African economy. That alone gives us a 0.006% contribution.
Maybe let me bring even Tino in this, because as an economist, don't know whether to call it some sort of bias, because you actually work for the Italian Trade Center. Fair deals at play. Africa obviously is the new frontier for investment. But given the kind of investment that's being poured in, like I just mentioned from Italy, what do you make of it?
I think there's a lot of, I don't know how to term it, perception that is being put. Let's look at the practical stuff. Let's look at Tocqueville Nkosi. That's an Italian company that's built that. I mean, that company's been here since 1994. The benefits from that are humongous. We've got hydro, so that's power. You've got irrigation, agriculture. You've got tourism, okay? So there's a lot of spill-off. So when people talk about fair deals, obviously it depends on the nitty-gritties and the contracting department, whatever ministry that would be and so forth, to determine whether that's going to be a fair deal or not. But let's look at this. It's two-way. Obviously, Italian companies are trying to bring in the equipment. We're also trying to gain skills transfer. So let's say equipment does come through into Zim. That employs thousands of people. Italians, yes, have pushed their equipment into Zimbabwe. But what about the spin-off effect? We're now producing. We now know how to use that equipment. We should now actually start engineering spare parts and actually learn how to put that together. So it can be a win-win. And then also from the agricultural sector, it's not a one-way ticket, because we have blueberries being exported. We've got granite being exported in the mining sector to Italy.
So it's about us taking advantage or leveraging on the fact that we can tap into another European market.
Exactly. And this opens up a huge thing. I mean, people like Zimtrade should be jumping at this and pushing. We've got good leather. We all know Italy make fantastic clothes and shoes. We've got the textile industry. We're reviving David Whitehead. This is where we should be focusing on and saying, okay, how can we push our produce into Italian stores or Italian fashion or Italian stores and stuff like that. I think that's where we're missing it. And when we look at a one-way ticket, what about the balancing act of what we're exporting?
But then, of course, Italy joined the G7 in 2022, fairly new. And one would probably ask, what kind of development, or are they able to even capacitate a lot of these huge infrastructural development projects, for instance, in Africa? Do they have that capacity for development in Africa?
I think it's, we can't look at it from one country assisting Africa. I think that's the wrong angle of looking at it. What we should look at, especially as Zimbabwe, is to say, how can we have bilateral relationships and how can we benefit from that? We can't look at the resource of one, relatively medium-sized country in Europe to then say, does it have capacity to capacitate the whole of Africa? Of course not. But the question is, can we deepen? Because once even you enter the Italian market, your clothing is going to go all over the world. And that could be, we had a fashion show in Victoria Falls at the end of last year, hosted by the Italian embassy. And we had one of the local artists actually paint, on the dresses, and they went back to Italy. So stuff like that, actually promotes Zimbabwe quite a lot. So we should look at it as a both-way, a two-way traffic.
Very engaging conversation going on as we continue to look at the Italy-Africa Summit, or should I say the summits as a whole, and incorporating Africa as a continent. Join us in the third segment with my guests as we continue to look at this very issue and how it is, of course, very important to the African continent. Welcome once again. The program is FOCUS54, our final segment, and we continue to focus on the Italy-Africa Summit. Recently, we had African leaders attend that very crucial summit and looking at issues of development, trade, investment, among many other important and crucial aspects. From your Davos to your Italy-Africa Summit, what has Africa benefited from this all? Let's continue with my guests. Still joining me in studio, I have an economist, Tino Kambasha, as well as Clive Chiridza, an international relations expert. So we were still touching on how Italy can actually afford to, or should I say, do they have the capacity to bring about that kind of investment for Africa? Clive.
Okay. Based on Prime Minister Meloni's assertions, she said she's ready to part with 5.5 billion for this business venture per se. And as she was explaining this Mattei plan, she then said there is need for us to also engage international financial institutions. And here we talk of the IMF, the World Bank, which are the Bretton Woods institutions, as well as the European Union and also other various donors in the international system. And this is proof that Italy has no sufficient funding to sponsor this program. But Africa, be cautioned, you have to be aware and cautious. Why? Because history has it that we have had bad relations, ill relations with these international financial institutions. How do they work? They will loan you the money and then you mortgage your resources. In a way or another, these pacts are designed in a way that it would be very difficult for you to pay back the loans in time. What then happens? Individual states begin to face budget deficits. To cover those, how do leaders then tackle the problem? They end up borrowing again, increasing that debt burden. We then finally reach a point where we are at a debt trap. And for us to come out of that as Africa, it would be quite cumbersome. So easier way out would be to continuously follow the trail, path and cycle of borrowing and borrowing and
so
borrowing.
Perennial borrowing.
Perennial borrowing, yes.
And that perennial debt.
And this broods poverty in Africa. So we need to be cautious when we approach some of these deals.
But then there is, of course, the notion that we've had so many summits, Western countries, previous engagements with Western partners. So one will ask, can we actually be assured that this summit will actually yield those tangible results and there will be that sort of equitable, resource allocation or investment? There will be some sort of fairness and transparency, and Africa not getting the back end of these investments?
Monica, the international system is quite ruthless, this international system. Now, for us to achieve the obligations you've stated, it now depends on what we are willing to do as Africa. I would pose the two factors as important solutions. An investment in soft power as well as hard power. Soft power, in what way? We need to invoke international law precepts where we get into signing of authentic and binding treaties, conventions per se. But international law is quite tricky. I'm even reminded of one of my mentors, Advocate Tima Fongoya. He poses a question. He says, is international law? Why is it that there is selective application of international law, especially if it's to the benefit of great powers?
And you can say that even with the trade policies.
Exactly.
It's often said it doesn't benefit the global south,
And
mostly.
so what do we have to do as Africa? We have to get involved in the crafting of the actual substantive and procedural elements of the guiding documents of these deals and ventures, not us being invited only to be presented a written and completed document representing a foreign policy of another nation. No, that is quite wrong. Secondly, I posed an investment in hard power as key and important to ensure that our interests are also safeguarded and henceforth achieving fairness. In terms of hard power, we need to make a deliberate investment in, number one, critical mass. Our population has to increase. Why? So that we create our own market and labor. I'm also reminded of the late Tanzanian president, Dr. John Magufuli. In a statement, he says, women, please free your ovaries. What was he referencing to? Issue of critical mass, because he knew if we've got a market, we then increase our own economic capability. We also need to look into our military capability as well as strategy and will as Africa. If we buttress all our plans and visions with these two, I'm sure we'll be in a position to say now we can be attaining fairness.
All right. Let me bring Tino into the conversation. Speaking about markets, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is at play. And given that it is yet to be implemented in most African countries, although we have South Africa, who actually took advantage. Yesterday, Cyril Ramaphosa, the President Cyril Ramaphosa, launched their preferential, agreement, part of the AfTA. How can we leverage on that? How can African countries take advantage of AfTA, for instance?
Well, I think it's a great initiative, and it's a quicker solution than my friend Clive had presented of increasing the population. So basically, Africa is at a disadvantage. We're not united. Even if you look at the United States, it's different countries that came together and formed one country. So having a free trade area is the first step in us becoming united. That African free trade area is going to allow us to push our goods into, imagine pushing shoes made from Gweru to then push that all the way up into Egypt. So I think it's one of the greatest moves. I can't wait for it to come into play.
Okay, nice, short and sweet, but so much at play, and we hadn't even touched on the geopolitical situation currently at hand. But with that said, I'd like to say thank you to my guest, Clive Chiridza, international relations expert.
My pleasure.
Tino Kambasha, of course, an economist. Gentlemen, it has been an absolute pleasure joining us on Focus 54. And once again, let's continue to delve around African issues and how best we can build the Africa that we want as we reach for Agenda 2064. My name is Monica Chanda. This has been Focus 54. The crew behind the scenes is thank you for watching.